Hey guys, it's Courtney, and this month I am one of the guest designers for My Favorite Things, so I'm super excited about this new release. I am using today the Santa and Friends stamp set, as well as the little trees from Cool Christmas, the coordinating dies, and also the in and out diagonal stitched rectangle die. This is not part of the release, but I'll be using this on just one of my cards. Today we're going to be creating two cards, both scenes, because I love creating scenes. One is going to be a one-layer card, and the other is going to have some dimension to it. So I have two pieces of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock here, and these are both cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I'm stamping my images with black licorice ink by My Favorite Things. This is Copic Safe. My bottom panel here is going to be my one-layer card. So where I'm stamping is the placement that I'm going to want my images, obviously. And this top panel, I'm just stamping down anywhere because I'm going to be die cutting these out later. As I'm stamping, I am masking out my images. Anything I want to be in the front, I'm going to be stamping first. There's not too many things that are kind of laying on each other here, but I will be doing some ink blending in the background, so I wanted to make sure that everything was masked. I didn't worry about masking their antlers. I'm going to be using regular distress inks here, so they're solid images, so I didn't worry about cutting out those little teeny tiny lines. And distress oxides you can certainly use. Just keep in mind that you're going to lose those black lines and you'll just have to use a Copic Safe pen to go over those later. Whenever I'm creating a scene, especially a one-layer card, I do use my masks. I didn't film this, but I use my masks and kind of lay them out on a panel just to kind of get my placement, kind of know where I want everything before I stamp everything down. That way I will know what I want in the forefront. Also, when I do my ink blending, I'm going to be creating a little bit of dimension as far as where the snow is. So I kind of need to know where I'm going to be stamping my images so that I know where my hills of snow are going to be when we bring out the distress inks. Once all of my images were stamped, I went ahead and put aside the one panel here and made sure that everything was masked out for the one-layer card, and we'll start the ink blending on that one first. I'm taking a piece of Eclipse masking paper here, and I'm using a scrap piece of paper, and I'm just going to cut out a squiggly line. It doesn't have to be anything specific, doesn't have to be anything perfect, but I'm going to mask out the bottom part of my panel first, and I'm going to do the sky. So I am using Tumbled Glass, Broken China, and Salty Ocean. These are really similar colors. You're not going to get all that much dimension, but I'm starting with my Tumbled Glass, just laying a light layer down, concentrating my darkest area with the Salty Ocean being on the top, blending that out with the Broken China, and then finally back to the Tumbled Glass to finish off that sky. I'll take my next panel, which this is the one that I die cut, and I'm just eyeballing it as far as where I should put that mask, but using the same colors, same order of colors, and adding my sky to this panel as well. Next, we'll go back to that original panel, and I'm taking another piece of Eclipse masking paper. I masked off the top. You don't need to do this. It was a waste of time, really. And I'm just cutting a curve, and I'm going to move this mask around. I'm using the Tumbled Glass, which is the lightest color, and just putting a little bit of shading there right above that mask. I'm not going too far up. I'm just creating the illusion of little snow hills. Now here you'll see that I went too far below that mask, and I have a line of the Tumbled Glass there. I just created another hill. It wasn't my intention to put a hill there, but to cover that up, that was the best way to do it. Now I'll use that same mask and move on to my other panel here. And I'm only going to put two little hills here because most of this area is going to be filled in with my images, my die cut images. So I just put two little hills. Most of it's going to be covered up anyway. And again, I just kind of eyeballed this, not really sure where I was going to need them. Next, I removed all of my masks for my one-layer card, and we'll move on to the Copic coloring. I'm only going to show you the coloring of the 1-layer card. I colored my other images the same exact way, just not really worried about shadows too much. I'm starting off with Santa's little face there, starting off with my E50 and laying out my darkest areas. My darkest color is the E04 and just adding a little shading underneath his hat and above his little beard or mustache there. Then my two mid-tones and then back to that E30 or E50 rather. Next, I'll move on to his little mustache and beard. I want these to appear white, but a little hint of gray. And so I'm starting with my C3, and I'm just adding my darkest areas. So it would be in the middle of his little mustache there, and then underneath his mustache where his beard starts. Next, I'll move on to the C1, and I'm just flicking that out a little bit further, but not going all the way down to the bottom of his beard. I do want to leave some of that white. Now, if you see those flick marks and you don't like the look of that, I take my colorless blender and go in the opposite direction. So I'm starting on the bottom of his beard and flicking my way up, and that'll get rid of most of those little flick marks that you see, but you'll still have that shading. I'm going to finish up coloring the rest of the white areas, which is the bottom of his little hat, the little cuffs on his pants and his shirt or jacket. Coloring these the same way, only I'm leaving a pretty big highlight there in the center, especially most of these things are round objects, especially Santa, he's a round object too. So your highlight will be in the center. And again, you can always take your white or your colorless blender to kind of get rid of those flick marks. I did want to add a little bit more gray to his beard so it didn't blend in with the rest of the white areas. And again, just smoothed that out with my colorless blender. Next, we're going to move on to the little reindeer here. I'm saving my red for last. Red is tough. Red is tough to blend sometimes, and if it bleeds, it's very hard to take away. So whenever I am coloring with especially a deep red color, I usually save that for last. I'm starting off with my lightest color here. This is the E30, just mapping out my darkest areas. We're working with the center light source here, so the shading for him, being he's off to the left a little bit, would be off to the left underneath his little belly. Started to extend that down a little bit on his legs. Underneath Santa's little hand there would also cast a shadow. Just doing a very small line with my darkest color, barely touching the tip of the marker to the paper. Next, I'll move on to my E33, and I'm just blending that out a little bit and thickening up some of those lines that we created, making sure that we maintain those shadows that we created. You can also add more shadows with your darkest midtone. You don't necessarily need to use your darkest color in every dark area. Next, I'll move on to the E31 and extend all of that out almost all the way, just leaving a small area for my highlight color. Once that was all blended, I did bring back in my E30 and just fill in the rest of those areas. I did color all three deer pretty much the same way, with the exception of the light source. The shading for that little flying deer would be off to the left, and for the other deer, it would be to the right. Next, I'm going to color in Santa's little gloves here, green, and I'm just using two colors. These are really teeny tiny areas, laying out my lightest color, adding my darkest color, and then blending that back out with my lightest color. Now, for the trees, I started by filling in the entire thing with my G21, mainly just to get the paper saturated. This helps to get a better blend. It just seems to blend better when the paper is a little bit saturated. Next, I took my darkest color, the G28, and I'm pretty much going right down the center and following the curves of the tree. And I'm just using the tip of my marker here. I'll take my G46 and extend those lines out a little bit further. Then my G24, extend them out even further, just leaving a very small highlight for that G21, and we'll fill in that entire area again, just like we did when we first started. I did color all three trees the same exact way. I'll show you just this one more. Again, covering the entire area with my lightest color, going in with my darkest color with just the tip of the marker, following the shape of the tree, extending that out with my G46, extending it out even further with my G24, and then again going back in with my G21 and filling in the entire area. I colored the other tree, I didn't record it, but the other tree the same exact way. For the little tree trunks there, I'm using my E59, E57, and E55. The darkest area would be underneath the actual tree. I also colored in the little reindeer noses with the E59 as well. And next we'll move on to that red. So I'm starting off again with my lightest color as always. This is the R22 and mapping out my darkest areas. So my darkest areas for his little hat would be on the bottom of it and kind of where it's curved over to the side. For his body, it would be underneath his little arms, on either side of his body, and underneath his mustache. For his pants, it would be underneath where his jacket is kind of hanging over, and again on either side. Next, I'll go in with my darkest color, and I'm just adding a tiny bit of this. I'm not doing any flicking here, really. I'm just pretty much adding a line. Where his hat is folded over, I did add one single flick there to make it look like the fabric is kind of bent and folded. Again, just doing one single line on either side of his jacket, underneath his arms, and on his legs. Next, I'll move on to the R46, and this is where I will start flicking that color out. Now, when you're flicking this color out, you're pretty much dragging it out. So you're going to start right where that darkest color is and flick that out, drag it out towards the middle. With the exception of the shadow that his beard creates, I'm using all flicking motions here. For the little tiny areas like his arms and his legs, I don't necessarily do too much flicking, just because if that bleeds outside of the lines or you go out of the lines, it's very hard to take red up. Next, I'll move on to my R27, pretty much doing the same thing, just extending those areas out a little bit further, just leaving room for that R22, that highlight color. And again, round objects are always going to have the highlight being in the center. Finally, we'll move back to that R22 and go over that entire area. I do start with a flicking motion, then I'll just fill the rest of the area in. The flicking helps to get that blend because you're pretty much dragging that color out. Once I had my red down for my Santa Claus, I also wanted to color these, I don't know what they would be, not saddles, but whatever blankets, I guess, that are on these little reindeer. I'm also coloring these red as well. Again, starting with my lightest color. This time I'm just filling in the entire area, being it's a pretty small area. For the flying reindeer, I'm concentrating the darkest area being in that lower left-hand corner. So I'm pretty much just doing like an L shape here, just extending that corner out a little bit. For the other deer, doing the same thing, only off to the bottom right. Go in with my two midtones, extend those out, and I am doing flicking motions here. This is a wide open area, even though it's a smaller area. So you want to make sure that you try to get the best blend possible. Next, for the R27, and then finally back to my lightest color, that R22, to blend all of that out. Now for Santa's little boots there, normally when I color something black, I use usually my cool gray colors, but I'm not going to do any shading here. I'm just going to color them solid black, as well as his little buttons on his jacket. Once all of my coloring was done for this card, I colored all of the other images the same exact way, and I am using the coordinating dies from both of the stamp sets to die cut these out. I did stamp them a little bit too close together, so I did have to make 2 passes through my die cutting machine, but these are pretty easy to line up, and the dies for the reindeer do cut out those little antlers, so just make sure they are lined up pretty good, or else you're going to get spaces between those antlers where you might not want them. Once all of my die cutting was complete, I took out my panel, the die cut panel, and I'm going to kind of just arrange these, make sure that they fit the way I want them to, but I'm pretty much keeping them in the same order as we did for the 1-layer card. Once I was happy with the placement of all of my images, I did take my Scotch foam tape and pop all of these up. This took a little bit of time because I cut little itty bitty tiny pieces for even their antlers. Once I had everything popped up other than this little flying reindeer, I realized that this other reindeer antlers were kind of stuck down. So I held up my card panel and used my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere this flying reindeer flat to my card panel. And next we'll move on to the sentiment. And I'm using one of the sentiments from the same stamp set. I'm going to take a scrap piece of black cardstock here. I'll treat this with my anti-static tool. I'm stamping with Versamark ink, and I'll use white embossing powder to heat set this. And once all of my embossing powder was completely melted, I did take out my paper trimmer and just cut this down into a skinny little strip. And I will pop this up with my Scotch foam tape as well, right there in the top right-hand corner. I initially cut my strip just a little bit too long. Didn't want it hanging too far off the card panel. So I just took my scissors and snipped off either side and popped that up right next to that flying reindeer. Next, I took that same Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere this panel flat to an A2 size note card, and we'll then go ahead and add the sentiment to our 1-layer card. And I am keeping this 1 layer, so I'm not popping up my sentiment. I'm going to stamp my sentiment, which also comes from the kit, different sentiment though this time, and I'm going to be stamping with VersaFine Onyx Black ink right there in the same spot as we put the sentiment for our other scene. Once that was done, I did go back in with a white gel pen to not only clean up some areas where I kind of got a little messy with my coloring, but also wanted to add some details. So for these little blankets or whatever they are on these reindeer, I'm adding polka dots to one and stripes to another. I'm also adding some reflections here and there on some of the trees off to the one side, as well as Santa's hat and his jacket. And then I did adhere this also flat to an A2 size note card. So those are the 2 cards for today, guys. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye.